I told one of my compliance friends about this, and she was like, so you're going to analyze the entire portfolio of the oil fund? You're nuts. You're absolutely nuts. And I said, yes, I am.
Money makes the world go round. It makes the world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are asking what could link oligarchs and grey-listed countries to the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. The Government Pension Fund of Norway, also known more commonly as the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, was established in the 1990s as a way to invest the country's surplus revenues from its oil and gas sector. To date, the fund has reportedly put money into more than 8,500 companies in 65 countries around the world, and is the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. So what happens when you take a public list of those declared investments and put them under the compliance microscope? What would you find? And what does this tell us about the nature of big money investment and its appetite for risk? In today's episode, we discuss the alleged business links between the Sovereign Wealth Fund, PEPs, and FATF grey list countries and Russian oligarchs, how common these potential links are in the real world, and how much does the average Norwegian understand about what tops up their pension. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Robin Lycka, Solutions Architect at Strise. Robin, thank you so much for joining The Laundry, finally.
It's a great pleasure to finally be on.
So we know each other pretty well, and at Strise, I just got to tell our listeners that you are our resident sanctions man. But can you tell our listeners about you, your background, and your role here at Strise?
Yeah, the sanctions man reference probably needs a bit of explanation. It's kind of this alter ego that I need to create to take on this role of when I'm doing these sanctions investigations and kind of the things that I'm doing that are not part of my daily job. But my daily job here at Strise is as a solution architect, meaning that I work closely with customers and potential customers on understanding their processes and how our solutions fit into their sphere and tech stack.
Thank you for that. And I know before we dive into the topic, you have a little disclaimer to give as well.
Oh yes, the disclaimer, very important. We are talking about the Norwegian Oil Fund. I want to emphasize that any findings or implications presented are for educational purposes only, should not be taken out of context. The data has not been confirmed nor assessed by any official representatives of Norges Bank Investment Management.
Yes, important to note for everyone here.
Yes.
With that, let's dive in. So let's start by looking at the findings that you've put together. So firstly, you have analyzed a public list of investments of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. But where did you find this list? Just so we start at the very beginning.
Good point. So when you're trying to build an interesting portfolio of something to analyze, it's very difficult because none of the banks are open, obviously, because of bank secrecy. So they can't share their list of companies that they onboard. So our synthetic data is based on assumptions. But the Norwegian Oil Fund is said to be the world's most transparent fund, and all of their investments are openly. You can download the list. It's very much structured. It's an Excel list of all their investments. So to me, this is like a gold mine of interesting things to look at because it's specific. And synthetic data is always boring because everyone knows it's not real. But in a real life dialogue, you kind of want to look at something that's tangible and you know what it is. And it's also, obviously the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. It's obviously interesting to look at.
So you have this public list. You have it downloaded in Excel. What comes next?
Well, I told one of my compliance friends about this, and she was like, so you're going to analyze the entire portfolio of the oil fund? You're nuts. You're absolutely nuts. And I said, yes, I am. So this is the way that I like to work. Like, I'm wired a bit differently. I really thrive with data and finding patterns. People might today often referred to as neurodivergent or neurodiverse. So the first thing that I do is just start structuring the data, and then obviously start looking at this data in Strise and trying to figure out, okay, what could the key important elements be? And obviously you then want to look at what are the risks from a bank's perspective. And that might not necessarily be the same risk as the oil fund, because they're investing in these companies. They're not banking for them. So there are two completely different approaches.
Yeah, that's important to note as well.
Yes. So when we talk about risk in this aspect, we would look at it as risk from a bank's perspective, not from an investment perspective. So then, it starts sifting through the data, and then there's always that sort of tingling sensation that, okay, there's probably something here. When you see companies registered in the Caymans, then you have a trail to follow. Obviously, all of the Russian investments, they were placed long before the invasion of Ukraine. And so they are now frozen, and, they're trying to scale back and divest in these companies. But there's always those interesting aspects, and those are the ones to follow.
Let's go through some of those top line findings. Can you give us an overview of what you discovered?
Yes. So I've done a combination of using our own tools and also sort of things that we are working on that's very much in beta right now, so not available to all of our customers. But we're an AI first company. So the cool thing with that is that we can work with prompts. So I just asked it to segment on risk. And when I did that, it's like, this will be a bit like just pulling up numbers. But out of the 11,000 investments, I found 120 sanctions risks, 2,700 politically exposed person risks, which is very much natural because a lot of these companies are state-owned companies.
Of course.
Yeah. And then there are 223 companies on the FATF gray list. So the gray list then is companies that you should, or countries that you should pay extra attention to or put under enhanced due diligence. And then there are 1,600 adverse media risk, meaning, there could be anything from fraud, embezzlement mentioned. So yeah, there were a lot of findings to go through, and I've merely just scratched the surface on the things that I find the most interesting and that are very clear and obvious.
When you say 120 sanctions risk, what does this actually mean?
Yeah, that was interesting because at first I thought 120 companies were sanctioned. But when looking at how the AI looks at sanctions risks, it segments into owned by a sanctioned entity or the owner of a sanctioned entity. So it goes both up and down. And then there were 20 direct sanction hits, and 7 of them were other sanction risks. So meaning it could be a company that previously were sanctioned. But the most interesting ones were the ones owned by a sanctioned entity.
And what are the rules around investing in companies owned by sanctioned entities?
Well, when it comes to investing, there are rules that are specific from the regulators. And then there's the ethical guidelines. And as far as I've understood, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, or the oil fund, as we often refer to it as, has their own set of ethical guidelines in addition to. So they are stricter than most oil funds. So when it comes to specific rules, there's the OFAC rule that says that if the entity is 50% owned, not controlled, but owned directly or indirectly by a sanctioned entity, the entity itself would be viewed as sanctioned as well.
And you also mentioned the grey list countries. And what does this data potentially tell us?
Well, if you look at the countries that are on the current grey list, there are countries that you would maybe deem as less risky. So if you have a company based in Croatia, Croatia is currently on the grey list. Now, most people know this as a country with where they go on vacation. But from an investment perspective, it's also a country that has a long cultural heritage politically as well for being run in a certain way. So there might be higher risks of corruption, etc. which means investing in a state-owned enterprise in Croatia might actually be more of a risk.
You are the sanctions man, so we need to talk about oligarchs. We have 6 oligarchs connected to the companies mentioned in the public list. What are some of the profiles of individuals we're talking about here?
It's hard to talk about this without talking about the actual names, but they are the usual suspects. To me, there are some of these oligarchs that you kind of know from media that they have very strong ties to Kremlin. And then there are others that are more seen as businessmen. Now, there are several oligarchs that are invested in companies in Scandinavia already. And then there are others that have a broad portfolio of investments. So if you look at companies that you would maybe not perhaps think to be companies that have shareholders that are oligarchs, companies like General Motors. So GM, I'm sure like a lot of Americans would probably start crying if they knew that there's an oligarch that has this big investment in GM.
I mean, if you have invested in that many companies as the Sovereign Wealth Fund has, it is hard to avoid being a co-shareholder with some oligarchs who are rich people who invest worldwide.
Yes. All of these companies are publicly traded companies. So that's amongst the sort of the limitations that are on the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Like Nikolai Tangen, he really wants to invest in non-listed companies. Now, that's probably more to do with his investment style than anything else. But if you think about it from like a large perspective, they are managing 1.4 trillion US dollars. Like how many companies in the world can you invest in without moving the share price? So if you purchase too much of a share, you will start moving the share price. So it's almost impossible for them to invest. There's so much money, it's impossible to invest it all.
And then you end up running into some oligarchs.
Yes, you will. And there are more companies as well. You know, we could mention several companies by name that have shareholders that are oligarchs. There's the German travel giant. There's GM, as mentioned. There are local companies in the Nordics, like the Sulzer Pumps, Nordic Wastewater Handling. So there are so many.
And those companies, they don't have, then it's not a minority shareholder post as well. They own a significant part of these businesses.
Yeah, some of them do. GM is minority. I believe it was something like 5%. The German travel giant is bigger, 34%, but still a minority shareholder per se, not controlling the company.
And also when we say oligarchs here, we do mean implicitly like now sanctioned oligarchs.
Some of them sanctioned, some of them are not.
So moving back to the profiles, what are some of the profiles of the individuals we're talking about here?
Well, as mentioned, some of the oligarchs are more deemed as business people. So they have a broad profile portfolio of investments, while others are more unsavory characters. There's individuals named on the list of bribe takers and warmongers by the investigative organization funded by Alexei Navalny. There's one linked to paying former FBI officials to investigate a rival oligarch. And then there are the ones that are more clever, like the ones that have negotiated their way out of the EU sanction status and actually succeeded in doing so.
Yeah, those are my favorites. Like, how did they do that? I'm always shocked when I hear those stories. Like, how did they do that? And are there any other findings that particularly stuck out to you that we haven't yet mentioned?
No findings that wouldn't stand the light of the day. So there's nothing shocking in this list of companies. But I think to me, being particularly interested in Russian oligarchs and sanctioned individuals and sanctioned companies, I think that was what kind of was the eye-opening event for me, that if you invest in publicly listed companies, you are inevitably co-invested in companies with sanctioned individuals and Russian oligarchs.
Your data problem?
And your workflow problem?
Now it isn't your problem. Strise is your ultimate solution to streamline customer due diligence and perpetual KYC.
Transforming your AML strategy from a manual burden to an automated winner.
Nice!
With AI-centric automation at its heart, Strise fast-tracks your time to revenue.
And because we know the future is as uncertain as it is exciting,
Strise is modular by design.
prepare for tomorrow's risks and regulations today. With flexibility that adapts to whatever the future holds.
And best of all,
you experience value from day one. Instant use out of the box.
Visit strise.ai and try our live demo today.
Back to the show. Okay, we've looked at the data. Now let's explore what they actually means. For our listeners outside of Norway, how can you explain the significance and importance of the Sovereign Wealth Fund to Norwegians?
Well, the Sovereign Wealth Fund is the fund that manages all of our wealth that was, when we started the oil adventure in the 70s, this was something that was supposed to benefit the people of Norway in the same way as water, power, electricity. So it's obviously become very capitalized, but it's now what should fund the future generations and retirement of future generations. So it's something that I believe all Norwegians are extremely proud of. We're this small country up here in the north, and we have the largest sovereign wealth fund of the world. I believe everyone is extremely proud of it, and looking at what the role of the wealth fund is, it's there to generate more money. That is the sole task of the wealth fund. Take this money and make it so that it's more money.
Yes, and it has been doing so very successfully.
Yes.
I agree. All Norwegians are very proud of this fund and very happy that it exists. And their investments are public, as you said. But do you think the average Norwegian is aware of the risks associated with being disinvested across the world?
No, I think we have a very high trust in Norway. So we trust that the fund management and the regulators will see to it so that we are not invested in risky companies and that we are invested in ethical companies. I think that's kind of also, maybe you asked earlier what if there was anything we haven't discussed. I think the investments into the Russian oil and gas companies were kind of eye-opening to me as well. There's $1.4 billion invested in what's referred to as carbon bombs in Russia. So Gazprom, Lukoil, all of the Russian oil and gas companies. I think that's kind of what baffled me a bit, because we have money generated from taking oil up from the ground, and we're supposed to invest this money. That's part of the investment profile or investment strategy, to invest it in other companies. Yet we see that the oil fund puts money back into other oil and gas companies. And to me, that's maybe something that I would expect less of.
And especially with the situation that's going on now as well.
Yes.
I mean, there are other sovereign wealth funds. There are huge funds across the world. From this, compliance risk perspective that we're looking through, do you believe the sovereign wealth fund has like a higher risk profile, or how does it compare to other funds?
I believe they probably have amongst the highest standard in the world, simply because of their ethical investment profiles and the ethical guidelines set out by law. So yes, I believe they hold extremely high standard both in compliance and ethics.
So none of the investment they have made, where they are then a shareholder alongside any sanctioned entity or individual, breaks any law.
No.
Like, it doesn't break any law. But what do you think about it from a moral perspective? And especially since the Sovereign Wealth Fund has such a high transparency, ethics, etc.
Very good question. I think I'd like to refer to what Finland did when we saw the annexation of Crimea. They were very early on scaling out of their investments in Russia, buying back their state-owned gas company from Gazprom. So I think Finland has been a good example on what they have done from a state perspective. Me personally, if you're asking me personally, I think we should have divested more earlier.
And with this analysis, does it say anything about the impact of sanctions on individuals, politically exposed people, oligarchs, sanctioned individuals?
Well, as Vladimir Putin has claimed himself, the European sanctions have done Russia no harm. He says that they have growth and we have decline. I'm not sure how well the sanctions are working. I'm a big fan of funny statistics. So if you look at something like, I believe it was Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, I can't remember which country, but one of the southern bordering countries of Russia, they now have 8 computers per capita. So, meaning each person in the country owns 8 computers because you're not allowed to import computers. So it's obviously sanctions evasions, passing computers through these borders. So is it working? Probably not as efficiently as we would like, but I believe I've seen quite interesting numbers as well on the effect that it actually has. Anything that comes out of politicians in this aspect is probably tactics.
And also, I think the sanctions, the implementation of sanctions, it takes time to see the true effect. And I think we still need to wait a bit and see how it all plays out. Back to the pension fund, do you think Nicolai Tangen and his management team and the investment team talk about sanctions a lot in their internal meetings?
I hope they do.
I hope so too. Has this analysis changed your perspective of the challenges of running an investment fund at this scale?
Yes, very much. It's been eye-opening looking at where the investments are placed and just thinking about if you have this amount of funds under management, where do you place them? The idea that you actually start running out of options where to invest and the ethical and legal implications as well. It's been very eye-opening looking at this data.
It's been very eye-opening to me, just this conversation as well. We are coming to the end of this episode, so we're going to dish out some quick-fire questions for you. I'll say a sentence, you just say the first thing that pops into your mind. Are you ready, Robin?
Yes.
What was the most surprising discovery of your deep dive into this data?
The co-ownership of 6 Russian oligarchs in the companies invested by the oil fund.
Can big business and investment funds ever truly detangle itself from oligarchs?
Extremely difficult because when you invest in publicly listed companies, you have no guarantee that there will be an oligarch coming in buying shares after you.
You're invested in an FATF grey list company. What do you do?
Good question. You put the company under enhanced due diligence and you make every effort to monitor what is going on within the company. Perhaps you consider divesting.
I agree. And also monitor those PEPs closely and make sure there's no corruption going on.
Exactly.
Based on this data, do you believe the Sovereign Wealth Fund is doing enough to protect itself from these types of risks?
Yes, I firmly believe they're doing more than enough to protect the oil fund from risk. My consideration is whether or not we should have done more early on to reduce the exposure to maybe more the ethical side and moral side of being co-invested in some of these Russian companies, for instance.
Do Norwegians pensioners realize they are potentially connected to grey list countries and oligarchs?
I will ask my mother.
And would she care if they did?
Yes, I believe that we could work on the transparency of why we make the investments, because if you're running the world's most transparent fund, it's not enough to just publicly go out and publish a list of all the companies you're invested in. I think they should say more about why they're invested in some of these industries, sectors, and countries.
And explain maybe the network around this company a bit more. It's not just about that one entity, but the ones around it as well.
Yes.
And finally, what is next for Sanctions Man?
So I believe we'll do some investigations with one of our close friends. We're delving into some interesting aspects of car washes and car dealerships here in Norway. Whether or not this will reach the light of the day, I'm not sure. It depends on how much we can expose publicly.
And how afraid we are of the people behind it too.
Yes.
That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Robin, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure to finally have you on. Where can people find and connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn /Robin Lycka, or you can reach me probably by my email, robin@strise.ai.
Money makes the world go round.
And thanks to everyone who was listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels. It really helps people to find us. Got a story you would like to share? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Your data problem and your workflow problem. Now it isn't your problem. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you all soon.
Money makes the world go
Yeah, money make a world go round.
round.